Good evening and welcome to the Class of 1990 Author Forum. It is so great to have y'all here for what will be an excellent event. I'm Jonathan Steinberg and I'm pleased to kick off this get together. And I want to thank the leadership team, thank Jenny for putting this together, plus all of the author participants. So before we get started, I do want to share a couple of items. Firstly, we hope all y'all are enjoying the quarterly newsletters that are put together by our excellent communications committee. So look out for these in your inboxes. They're coming, like I said, every 3 or 4 months. Second, as you may have figured out, we are actually hosting these class events every fall and spring leading up to our 35th reunion in 2025. We had the game one back, of course, a few months ago, and we'll have other ones coming up. So for these events, as well as the newsletter, we, of course, welcome your ideas and suggestions. So if you have any, you can send them to, get your pen out, brown1990leadership, that's all one word, at gmail.com. So again, brown1990leadership at gmail.com, and we'll read them and do something. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Ashley Johnson Mason. She's worked in book publishing for more than 30 years. And as you've probably read, she is currently the associate managing editor at Algonquin Books, Chapel Hill. And as you also likely saw in the newsletter and the announcement, one of her career highlights was attending a party in the mid-1990s at Judy Blume's apartment. That caught my eye. And I had to wonder if it was called Iggy's house. In any event, thank you, Ashley, and let's roll over to you.
Good one, Jonathan. Good one. Okay, well, it's great to see everybody. I'm assuming that everyone who is here has already read the bios of our authors, so I'm not going to read them out loud. I do want to, Gil's bio has a little bit of a correction to it, so I just want to say that Gil no longer lives in Southern California. He's now in the Central Coast region of California, and he works at the Dunn School as the director of communication studies and assistant marketing director. But then the rest of his bio is correct. So I thought I'd start off with a fun, kind of silly question for all the authors. I'd like to hear what was your sort of coolest moment as a professional writer, when you kind of said, wow, this is just so cool. I'm actually being paid to write. What kind of hit home for you that you were making this work? Any kind of funny or quirky anecdotes that anybody has?
Well, for me, it's sweet and sour. So for me, it was when my agent told me that the New York Times was reviewing my first book.
Oh, wow. That's huge.
But a week later, when I read the review, I was a bit less pleased with it. But yeah, I guess I tried to take the all publicity is good publicity point of view. So that's mine.
Yeah,
I had a kind of go ahead, Tanuja. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, when I had a book event, I had some young people come up and ask me to sign their Harry Potter books.
Oh, wow.
Does that count as a victory?
Yeah.
I can't really sign that because it's I didn't really write it, but that was kind of funny. Yeah, I guess just the fact that I think that I was so I sold my first book before writing it. It's kind of like a whole story that involved CBGBs and a bunch of other stuff, but I had a deadline in place, and then I was so excited that somebody was waiting for it that I kind of dove in, and it never actually occurred to me that anyone was going to actually read it. So I think
Tanuja, did you sell it just based on a summary?
Yeah, so what happened is I met the person who became my editor, David Levithan, through the violinist in a band that I was in New York City, a punk pop band, and she organized a whole night out, a group of people to see Fiona Apple at Roseland, and Fiona Apple ran off stage. It was this concert that became kind of a known thing because she sounded amazing but ran off stage. I met David, And a few months later, we were moving to London, and I went to see him about getting an editing job or a copy editing job, because I wanted to be a writer, but I was mostly being a copy editor. And
Well, you were a copy editor at YM Magazine.
I was,
which I just love that. I love that.
But so he thought I was there to pitch a book, and I ended up pitching a book. It was sort of serendipitous and accidental, and that's how it ended up selling on a proposal after that.
Oh, wow. That's
signing a Harry
incredible.
Potter book was a high.
I think for me, it was when I could actually say that I had an agent, and I actually could tell someone, talk to my agent. And, yeah, that actually happened. And then also being a journalist for many, many years before writing my first book, actually being assigned a publicist instead of getting press releases from publicists. That was really odd. And then the other thing was seeing that before the book came out, that my name was mentioned a whole bunch of times in Australian newspapers, because that's where the book really was written and takes place. And of course, no one knew me over here. So that was really kind of funny.
My favorite thing, I had a book come out of 2014 called I Pity the Poor Immigrant, which is a Bob Dylan song. And I went to do an event in Oxford, Mississippi, where there's this incredible bookstore called Square Books. And they are all plugged into the cultural world of Oxford, Mississippi. So there's a radio show called Thacker Mountain Radio, and they kind of partnered with the bookstore to do these events so it's not just a book thing, it's a lot of other things. And the house band, before I came out to do my little segment, the house band played the Dylan song, I Pity the Poor Immigrant. And I don't know, that was fantastic. I loved it.
Life is good. Yeah. That is great. And then when we were in the separate room before everybody got here, when I was talking just to the authors, and actually John and I got there first, and I asked John something that I think a lot of writers ask themselves: can an introvert succeed as a writer in today's publishing landscape? Do y'all have any thoughts on that? An introvert and or somebody who does not want to be on social media.
It's a lot harder.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an introvert and I hate social media. And I feel like a dinosaur for that reason. I think it's changed forever, and that's, you either get with that or you don't, But I had the weird experience of interviewing poets for a job where I teach at Tulane, and I was kind of amazed by how poets who are, we're old now, so these are younger people, brilliant poets who are incredibly great at writing poetry are also now very, very good at self-presentation and being charming and being witty, you could imagine any of these poets going on a late night TV show and doing just fine. And it was like, that's part of the skill set that one kind of has to have now, I think, which is, it's different. I didn't have to have that skill set, don't have it. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, what I told Ashley off air, so to speak, was I mentioned that like a year ago, I was on, my books are dating books, and I was on this dating podcast with this guy who was a former contestant on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. I don't watch these shows, but he, he's this young British guy, very good looking, cute accent. He has like a gazillion followers on Instagram. And before we started recording, he was asking me, well, I have an idea for a dating book, but I'm not a great writer, but I have an agent, and he's convinced that I should write the book. And I told him, your agent is right, because if you have 600,000 followers on Instagram and you're good looking like this guy is, and you have a cute British accent, a publisher will find a way to sell that book. And this is kind of the world we're in now. I mean, as I was telling Ashley, I deleted my Twitter account a year ago, mostly for mental well-being. But I doubt if I wanted to write a third book, I could without being on Twitter.
Yeah, I got like my first book came out before all of that in 20 years ago, actually now. And then the sequel was 10 years later, and like everything had changed. With the first book, I was editing my final edits, pencil to paper.
That must have been fascinating.
Oh yeah, like FedExing to my editor in New York from London, and we were sending these massive boxes back and forth. And then when the second book came out, they said we had to do a little, like there was the Rip Van Winkle effect, because I had never used track changes. And, they actually like had a little tutorial for me to teach me how to use track changes. And then we had this whole meeting about getting on social media. And I remember just kind of leaving that. We were like in a big room with a handful of people at Scholastic to kind of talk about,
with a handful of, or the bunch of 22-year-olds.
Yes. Yeah. Kind of that kind of thing. And I remember actually feeling ill. By the time I left the meeting, I just kind of, it is very not like what an introvert or even an extroverted introvert wants to be doing necessarily. And they said, just get on all of those things. You can try it out. If it doesn't work for you, you can get off. And I've been like, now I've just been on all of those things. And sometimes I fantasize, like I think a great measure of success as a writer would be to be at a point where you can get off of all of social media.
Absolutely.
That would be like kind of a certain kind of success. But I'm still on there, and it's kind of hard to get off of some of those things when you're on there.
I'm going to deviate a little bit and say that the person who wrote the foreword to my book is someone whose work I had really admired from afar. He's an Australian author whose work I had read on Australian rules football for years. And I reached out to him on Twitter. And it was his daughter that was running his Twitter handle. And he got in touch with me. And we've become close friends ever since then. And that was about maybe 7-8 years ago. And
well, Gil, the foreword that he wrote for your book was just lovely. Like he obviously is really fond of you.
Well, if I can just share a real quick story. When I first met him, I reached out to him on Twitter, and we met at the oldest pub in Melbourne. Actually, no, we met at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which to Australian rules football is kind of like Yankee Stadium to Major League Baseball. And I'm not kidding you. He was talking to me about all these things that happened there, a lot of which I knew. And he was just like, do you want to go and have a beer? I'm like, of course I want to go have a beer. And, and when we get there, we're literally finishing each other's sentences to the point where he said, what are you doing tomorrow night? I said, hey, hopefully hanging with you. And, we ended up hanging out that night. We built a really strong friendship. And I'm really proud to say that when Martin Flanagan came to the United States, he spent his first night in the U.S. At my wife's and my house, and we even did the Jack Kerouac thing, and we traveled up north to San Francisco from L.A. to the point where now, if I'm looking for a place to stay in Melbourne, my home away from home is his front room now. So I always tell my students this too: is never be afraid to reach out in any means to someone whose work you really admire, because you don't know where it's going to take you. So that's really pays off in many ways.
Well, then, Gil, let me I'll direct my next question to you. You are obviously just steeped in Australian culture. And was Australian rules football the entry point, or did the just general Australia come first and then it became the football?
Well, I'll tell you what, the entry point were Qantas commercials way back when I was about 4 years old. Some of you may be old enough to remember them, where they had this koala bear.
We're all the same age, Gil.
Yeah, well, that's true too. Yeah, okay. So there was this koala bear, and it was being voiced by this American actor. And I remember what it sounds like. Please don't fly Qantas to Australia. It was like wanting people not to come and disturb the eucalyptus leaves and things like that. And then in middle school, I had a really culturally aware teacher that taught us about some fundamental things about Aboriginal Australian culture. And then it started growing. And if you remember in the 80s, early in the mid 80s, we had things like Mad Max, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Paul Hogan's Foster's commercials. I think I bought every album Men at Work ever put out. And In Excess was popular when we were in college. So, but then somewhere in there, ESPN was just starting up and it needed programming to fill up its overnights. And some of you may remember that they actually aired the Victorian Football League, which later became the Australian Football League. And I had never seen anything like that. I saw these guys wearing what looked to be basketball uniforms, playing on this field that was bigger than an American football field, and these umpires behind the goalpost that didn't have crossbars wearing these white hats and gloves and signaling that for goals. So that was all building toward it. So I think Australia's been calling to me my whole life. And so, I go around telling people, that, I'm really an Australian trapped in an American's body. So, it kind of works out that way. And then the other thing was that about this whole journey was when I took my first trip to Australia, was by myself in '99. And I just told myself, okay, well, don't expect what you're going to see in the come and say good day ads. No one's going to say good day, mate, when you first get off the plane. So what happens? I go through customs and the first person I talk to, good day, mate. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. It really is like that. And so that's just where it's been. And I've been fortunate enough to travel back and forth to Australia about 12 times, to the point now where a lot of friends of mine say I'm an honorary Aussie. And I really would like to live there one day.
That is amazing. One of my favorite mystery writers, Jane Harper, is Australian. I highly recommend her to anybody who likes to read mysteries. Okay, well then, Tanuja. I was reading some of the reviews of Born Confused when I was preparing for this. And to their credit, like the reviewers really seemed to get that this was a groundbreaking young adult novel. It was exciting just to read, I read the Publisher's Weekly review, the Kirkus review. They both said, this is, something really exciting is happening here. And because it is considered the first South Asian American young adult novel. So now 20 years later, is it hard for you to believe that there really was a time when that was considered just so new and pioneer? Because now, I feel like a lot of the best YA novels are about Asian American, or written by Asian Americans. It's just, I can't believe that it was really not that long ago that you were writing the first one. Is that weird for you?
It's 20 years that are an era and a blink of an eye kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
For me, when my parents were the first from both sides of the family in India to immigrate to the States, and they had already broken a bunch of rules in India. They had an out of caste love marriage at a time where arranged marriage is an in caste. Even now, that's usually what would happen. They fell in love in medical school, and they came to the US, and they actually sponsored a lot of our family and friends over the years. And the town that we lived in Western Massachusetts, Wilbraham, Massachusetts, home of Friendly's ice cream, we were the first family of our kind of brown actually in town. And there was nobody who looked like us really, on TV, on the movie screens, in magazines, on our bookshelves. On our bookshelves, there were books from India, like Gandhi's biography and letters that Nehru wrote to his daughter and things like that. But there was nothing. And then there were books like Judy Blume and The Witch of Blackbird Pond and all, all those sorts of books. And there was not really any bridge. And to the point where I only realized later that there were no brown people even in my imagination. And from childhood, I was constantly writing short stories and poems and inventing bands and like drawing their album covers and writing their bios and all. And never, ever, ever were there people of color in any of these projects. And there weren't any in my imagination. I don't even know, like, I don't know if I was even dreaming in shades of brown at that time, unless I was dreaming about, things about my family or that. And then when I wrote Born Confused, I mean, actually it was at Brown that I learned the term ABCD when I was a senior, and I became friends with a group of students from Karachi and Lahore and Bombay and Delhi. And the term stands for American Born Confused Desi. And it's a term that these like people from, who grew up in these motherland countries created for confused kids of the diaspora growing up elsewhere, or supposedly confused kids of the diaspora. And I remember being super excited that there was a term for this neither here nor there space, like this kind of in between, which I thought was a nowhere. And also a little bit like indignant, because it's not a very complimentary term, and who gets to decide that shouldn't we be naming ourselves? And but that was like, that I think was the spark that sort of shone its light. It took me a few more years to figure out what to do with it. And then when it came time, when I was like sort of ready to write that story, I wrote Born Confused to kind of fill that hole on my childhood books shelf and to redefine the ABCD, the confused, to turn it into a C for creative. And in the writing process, I guess I really realized I hadn't seen that story where, the heroes in stories like didn't really reflect my family or the people I knew, or like the incredibly dynamic South Asian American diaspora art scene in the late 90s in New York that I was a part of. And so I wrote it to kind of honor those communities, family born and found. And now it's wonderful. There's such a richness of choice. There's never enough, so there's always room for more books and more stories. But just an incredible number of authors writing about all kinds of South Asianness, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, queer stories, all kinds of stories. And I look at my daughter's bookshelves. Of course, I have supplied a lot of the books on those bookshelves because I know a lot of those writers. But I mean, it's a thing of beauty to behold, and I find that very exciting. So it feels like it's been a long time, and it feels like it's kind of it's all been kind of a continuous intertwined story in a way. You know what I mean? Like we're all kind of telling the story of South Asian America over this period of time, and it's lovely to have so much more company now. The company was there, but to have it kind of like in print and all.
That's fabulous. Zach, a big theme running throughout your book is the carceral system and the systemic issue or systemic failures within it. So I'd like to hear you talk more about, I know, one of your books is a narrative nonfiction about your own story about the murder of your father. And then that theme, the justice or injustice pops up in all of your other books too. And I think I saw an interview with you where you said that you really can't help writing about that. Is it gratifying to you lately that like that's so much of part of the national conversation now?
It's gratifying. That's an interesting word. I fell into writing about incarceration through coincidence. I met this woman who's now a good friend of mine, who's a photographer who also, had previously been doing a lot of work about photographic work about incarceration and crime because her mother had been murdered. And that makes it sound more logical than it was actually for her. She ended up doing this work. And then I met her in New Orleans. And it turned out we had all of these bizarre coincidences. You know, I had a parent who was murdered. She had a parent who was murdered. They were both murdered in Phoenix, Arizona. Both were contract killings. The same detective worked both of these cases.
Oh my goodness.
When she read my book about my father's thing, she recognized a lot of the figures. And neither of us is from New Orleans, and yet many years later, we both ended up living in New Orleans in the same neighborhood, like literally 3 blocks away from each other. And when we first met, she was going to go to Angola prison to do another photography project, which was tied up with this passion play they were doing there, the story of Jesus. And she asked me if I wanted to go along, and I said, yeah, sure, of course. And that's how I ended up writing about incarceration at first. That was 10 years ago.
And the entire passion play was performed by the inmates?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a group of 80 incarcerated actors, half of whom were women who came each morning from the women's prison to practice the play and then to perform the play over the course of months. And so it was a very unusual experience in a million ways, but one of the ways was that you had men and women who were never allowed to see men and women who were now able to work on a play together and actually have quite a bit of time together. These practice sessions would go on from like 8:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon. And so they were all day. And because you have
and
80
Angola
actors,
is the maximum security prison in Louisiana, isn't it?
yes, yeah. It's one of these old prison farms that are in the state that, there's a few of them in the South. Angola is the maximum security prison in Louisiana. It's the state prison. It's a very unusual prison in the sense that it is as large as the island of Manhattan.
Oh my God.
In terms of its geography. It's a very peculiar place. Peculiar is not even the word, but it's a place that I've gotten very involved with. That was 10 years ago when I first went there. I became friends with a lot of people who were in there, who are still friends and still very close to me, to the point of people who I speak to every week. And so I guess it is gratifying that in those 10 years that there is more talk about incarceration and more talk about it as a problem. I'd like to think that we were doing something about it. I'm not sure that I feel that way. I think we're making some baby steps about it, but the problem is much bigger than prison. The problem is a giant problem about how this country is. And it's going to take a lot to really make the kinds of changes we need to make. We'll see what happens. I don't know. I don't want to be too negative, because even in Louisiana, where we have in the past had the highest incarceration rate in the United States, there have been improvements in Louisiana in those 10 years. Significantly, for example, you have to have a unanimous jury in Louisiana now to be convicted of a crime, which you didn't used to have to be. And so that is actually a huge step forward. It may actually lead to people getting out of prison who are in prison now, because once you sort of say that it's not okay to be convicted by a non-unanimous jury, then you open up this territory of, can we re-adjudicate these cases from the past? So I am glad that we're having more of a conversation about it for sure, though. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, I can't think of a good segue to John's book from that. So John, so
this is my role in the world, is to be the heavy lead weight that becomes impossible to segue from.
Well,
Well,
just own it.
I wish I felt as passionately about the topic of my books as Zach does about his and as Tanuja does about hers. But I have to admit, I had an agent before I had a book idea. This is one of those things where, I ran a bunch of ideas by him, and he kind of liked my idea of a book about why it is there are so many fabulous single women in their 30s and 40s who can't seem to find a decent guy, and looking kind of a demographic economic look at this topic. And that was the origin of the book. It wasn't I honestly wish I had a book idea that I felt as passionately about as Tanuja and Zach did, but this was really I love my books, but I approach them more as a business venture probably than
Well, when I first started reading Datanomics, one of the things that struck me was that it's this very obvious problem, or not problem, but it's this very obvious issue that's easy to understand, but yet nobody's really talking about it.
So maybe I should give the Cliff Notes version of the premise of Datanomics, which the Datanomics explores this phenomenon that, as I said, many of us are familiar with, which is fabulous women in their 30s and 40s who can't seem to meet a decent guy. And my wife and I had a million of these friends. I worked with but lots of these women at Fortune magazine. And it was one of these things at Fortune where I covered oil and gas, where all the guys at Fortune were either married like me or involved in long-term relationships, whereas the women, who I think I can safely say had more going for them dating wise, the ones I was friends with had all these dating horror stories. And the point of Datanomics was exploring why dating had become so much harder for women than for men. And I can dig more into the details, but the gist of it is that for the past 30 years, we've had 1/3 more women than men graduate from college in the US and in other Western countries, 1/3 more women than men. And this wouldn't matter so much if we were all more open-minded about whom we date and eventually marry. But the reality is that we are not open-minded about these things.
You call them cross-collar.
Well, yeah. So I'm an advocate of what I call mixed collar marriage, but I can advocate for it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so as a result, we have two separate dating pools, kind of a college grad dating pool with too many women and a non-college grad dating pool with too many men. And there's a lot of interesting research that's been done on how these uneven sex ratios affect behavior. And, I'll throw this out there. A big argument in Datanomics is that the rise of the hookup culture particularly among young college grads has nothing to do with porn or Facebook or anything else. It's largely linked to these uneven sex ratios.
I've lived in North Carolina for 24 years now, and I don't have daughters, but I have heard just anecdotally from so many of my friends that do have daughters who go to Chapel Hill about the gender imbalance. And I do think it is like that at so many, especially the big state schools.
Chapel Hill is 60-40, which means 3 women for every 2 men. These sex ratios have, there's all sorts of social science that's been done showing how these sex ratios affect behavior. It's not that young people in college are doing a head count and saying, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of her and 1, 2, 3 of me, so I'm going to behave differently. It's more of kind of a when in Rome thing. And one of the things I do in the book is I use college campuses as a case study. I kind of rank 40 or so major public and private colleges by their sex ratios, and then pair that data with how students describe the dating scene on their college campuses. And the dating scene descriptions were kind of written by students and came from the College Prowler, college guide. And you can really see, I can give you a couple examples. You can really see from those descriptions how the sex ratios change the dating culture. So like at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, which is 66%.
Yeah.
66% men, 2 men for every 1 woman. The comment is about, from kids about dating at Georgia Tech. It says Tech is a fairly monogamous campus for the most part. People like to be in relationships. At Caltech, similar ratio. I actually did a focus group there. The comment is students here tend not to date but have relationships. Breakups are rare and many couples get married after Caltech. And then on the flip side, New York University, which is 61% female, which is 3 women for every 2 men. The comment from, in College Prowler about dating at New York University was guys take advantage of the male to female ratio. Most guys have no plans of settling into a long-term relationship. Or BU, Boston University, where coincidentally my son went, but he's gay and he has got no advantage from any of this. But at BU, the comment from students there about dating, and BU is 62% female. The comment was, freshman year is a sexual explosion. There are girls to go around and around again. So you can really see, like, using the college campuses, how the prevailing sex ratios affect the behavior. And that's kind of my jumping off point for datanomics.
I mean, I thought it was fascinating, but I do have to wonder, do you think you could get that book published right now? Now that we talk about gender in such a different way, even just in the 5 years or 7 years since it was first published?
I mean, I think I could. I would write it differently. I mean, I have to. I mean, the reason I wrote my second book, Make Your Move, is because I had some regrets about the first one, and that, like, I didn't have any skin in the game with the first book. Like, I was a married guy with kids, and to me this was like an exercise in anthropology, whereas the women who read my book, and when I went out and book tour, I became more sensitive to this. Like, this wasn't a curiosity for them. This was
it was personal.
It was personal. It was their life. And the first book didn't really offer a lot in terms of solutions. And that's partly because I considered myself to be this super serious journalist. And the last thing I wanted to do was become the love doctor. So I kind of resisted my editor's efforts of, like, providing dating advice. There's a little bit in the last chapter, but she kind of had to pull it out of me kicking and screaming. But in hindsight, that was probably a mistake. So I do think the book would get published, but I think if it were me, I would write it differently. Like, there was a little lack of empathy in the first book, I would say.
I mean, I have to say, I rarely, JB knows this, in Victoria, I rarely read nonfiction. I love to escape into a novel, but I really enjoyed reading your book and Gil's book. I just was like, maybe I need to branch out a little bit more into what I'm reading.
Thank you.
So how are we? Do we need to start taking questions, Jonathan and JB, or how are we doing?
I think we can go with maybe another question or two, and then people should put questions in there. Somebody wants to know how Brown ranks in your College Prowler ratings, John. So just let us know the answer on that one.
So Brown is 50-50. And I can't remember, hold on. I can't remember if I included Brown in the book, but my recollection is, yeah, actually I did. So Brown is about 50-50. And the comment was, students choose between serial relationships, random hookups, or celibacy. Now I have to say, when I read the college prowler description for Tufts, I actually thought it was more reminiscent of what I remembered from Brown. And let me read to you the Tufts description. And Tufts, like Brown, is basically 50-50. And the description for Tufts was, halfway through sophomore year, people begin to pair off and generally stay paired off through senior year. And to me, that was a little more familiar to me. But what I did find interesting is that these schools that are 50-50 had a kind of a more normal dating culture. And actually, even University of Miami, which everybody thinks of as being this giant party school, Miami's 50-50, and the comment there is random hookups are common in the beginning, but after a year, relationships take over. So you can see, like, even in these classic party schools, the sex ratios make a difference.
All right, so I have a question, actually, if I can ask it, which is that I have the Perkins question. I do want to know what was in the water at Perkins that created 4 out of the 5 people on, I don't know, John, if you were ever on Perkins or Zach, but there are lots of Perkins people. And then the second thing is, did you guys ever take a class together or like learn the craft of writing together at activities, or like, what were some of the things about the Brown education side that like formed your writing habits as journalists? Sorry, Ashley, I just was.
No, it's okay.
Well, I wrote for the Brown Daily Herald, and I was also a writing fellow. And then also when the College Hill Independent came out.
I bet you were a great writing fellow, Gil.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's funny because with November 1st right around the corner, I'm working with a lot of high school students on their college essays. And I probably wrote the worst one ever, which is motivating me to work with a lot of high school kids. But Tanuja and I didn't live far apart from each other on that same hallway. And so it's funny when you shared, Tanuja, that story about you and Pamela giving away free samples at the Ivy Room that were far too generous. I'm like, yeah, that does sound like them, because you all had big hearts and were really, really generous people. But I remember, I'm just going to pick on Tanuja for a second, because I just think that, we did have a lot of talks about cultural identity and ethnicity. And Tanuja, you'll be very happy to know that when I was teaching American literature, that I required reading by Jhumpa Lahiri, who is an author I really, really admire. And, it's the same kind of situation, writing about South Asian Americans in Massachusetts. And I just think that with Tanuja, she also, I'm just going to plug her for a minute, because she also wrote an incredible article about 9/11. We both actually wrote about our 9/11 experiences, but I was really moved by hers. And I love the fact that we were able to talk about our different cultural experiences, and Tanuja, to have you turn that into some really great writing is really brave and very needed. And so I'm really glad that your daughter has a lot of the books that just wouldn't have existed back when we were coming through.
Aw, Gil, right back at you. I also love that we had those conversations. So we were like across the bathroom from each other, if I'm remembering the layout correctly. But we had those conversations, and then we also like danced in your room, turned up the music, like it was a conversation, it was a dance, and it was beautiful. It kind of like took all sorts of shapes and forms. And I think also perhaps being in Perkins allowed us, I mean, a lot of people talked in a lot of dorms, but we were in another zip code. we were out there. And I think possibly writers, maybe there are a lot of writers from Perkins, because being a writer is sort of like living in another zip code in your mind for long periods of time. But the relationships were amazing, like the friendships that we formed, in Perkins and through those conversations have been nourishing for the soul for all these years, ever since
freshmen
then.
don't live there anymore.
No, very true.
It just kills me.
Yeah.
Zach, weren't you and Tanuja in the same writing class too?
We were in Meredith Steinbach's creative writing class. I took that class twice. And I
Yeah.
don't remember which one. Were we in it the first or fall or spring together? I don't remember.
I thought we were maybe both. It was
Maybe
EL,
both.
EL20, because ever since then I've named like my folders on my computer that have writing in them EL20, like
Oh,
stuff and everything. But I have to
That's
say,
hilarious.
Zach like arrived, he sprung fully formed from the head of the universe. I was just like, my struggle with Zach was I never had any kind of comment I could give that would be useful. Maybe I inserted a comma once in something you wrote, but it was just
That
like
was wrong though.
But I mean, your writing was through the roof. It was an amazing workshop. I
yes.
remember your stories.
I didn't take any creative writing courses until senior year. I had this strange thought that I had to read all of the classics of the world before I was allowed to put pen to paper or something like that. And then I went to Paris for my junior year abroad, and they had a class that was called stylistique, where you had to write in French. You had to write pastiches of the great French writers, and that was the first time I allowed myself to write creative writing. I mean, that was it. And I guess I learned that if I could do it in French, I could probably do it in English.
oh, that's amazing.
I mean, I suspect all these answers are different for fiction writers than nonfiction, but from a nonfiction perspective, I don't think I ever took a writing class at Brown, but I do remember in my first newspaper job, my favorite editor as a young journalist, Tom Carney, he told me that whenever he interviewed prospective reporters, the first question he would ask them is, why do you want to be a journalist? And if the answer was, I like to write, he would not hire them.
Oh, wow.
And that's because from his perspective, he was in the news breaking business. He could always have a copy editor fix your writing. But he needs somebody who can break news and who's curious and can sort of uncover interesting stories. The actual writing was of secondary importance to him, which for me was kind of an important life lesson, because I think I came to that job. I'm probably lucky I didn't answer because I like to write when I interviewed with him. Because I did like to write, but I learned a lot about writing and journalism from somebody who told me he didn't really value writing. Let's put it that way.
Okay, before it scrolls up and I can't see it anymore, I had a question came to me directly, but it's for Tanuja. And actually, this is a great question. It's from Elizabeth. And I was actually going to ask this myself. Tanuja, when you were writing Born Confused, were you writing it as an adult novel or YA, or were you just writing the book that you were writing?
I think I was writing the book I was writing, but because I sold it before I wrote it, and I sold it to Scholastic, I mean, the years that I lived in New York leading up to that book, I had been exploring, once I realized I could actually put brown characters in my stories, I had been exploring writing Indian American coming of age stories. The character, like the protagonist in those connected stories, was in her 20s. There were older characters. I also did like a couple short films that had Indian American protagonists in their 20s. And because of that sort of serendipitous meeting with David Levithan and selling him thinking that I was there to pitch a book, I wasn't there to pitch a book, and then I pitched a book, I ended up making the characters teens because it was Scholastic. I already knew that it was going to be Scholastic.
Okay.
And, so I didn't really think of it particularly as young adult. I think I just thought coming of age, and that to me is something we never stop doing, which maybe is why often coming of age stories resonate for people of all ages. So I just thought of it as the coming of age, and it was, you know, the coming of age of these characters who are sort of 17 years old, but also Born Confused and Bombay Blues, the sequel, are about the coming of age of South Asian American culture, diaspora culture, the coming of age of New York City, viewed through that lens. The sequel, Bombay Blues, the coming of age of Bombay as well. That book, the sequel, is set largely in the context of the kind of indie arts and music scene in Bandra, in suburb in Bombay, and the sort of reverse diaspora, like a lot of people who've sort of left and then gone back, or kind of Indian Americans going there to find their way and explore that scene. So sort of conscious, but not exactly. And I'd spent years working just before writing Born Confused, copy editing for teen magazines. So YM Magazine, Twist Magazine. One of my best friends was at Sassy, which was incredible.
Wow.
Sassy was legendary. So I was kind of in that world. And I think that kept me in touch with.
Yeah, you were in that headspace. Yeah.
Yes. I was in that headspace through those jobs. And then I also feel like possibly I have never fully left my teenage headspace. So it wasn't that hard to access.
Yeah, that's what all the best YA writers are able to do. Like still remember what it feels like to be in that stage of their life. That's just so impressive to be able to do that.
I feel like we kind of all, maybe like, because you put pen to paper, or, you know, finger to keyboard, or whatever it is, there's sort of a way of proving that connection. But I feel like we all have that, because so many formative, you know, moments happen in those years, like childhood and young adult. I mean, I am still traumatized today from the president's fitness exam and gym class from my childhood. That's never too far for me to access a kind of pain as well.
The flexed arm hang.
Yes.
Yeah.
600-yard dash. I had to walk off like the last half a lap of the 600-yard dash in 5th grade. I was like so not able to run. But I did read all the time. I was awarded an exercise mat for reading 55 books for the MS Readathon. I still have it.
Hey, Ash, there's another question, because I can go back further than you can, I think, that I wanted to make sure that we got, because I think there's a bunch of journalists that are on from our classmates. So they have a question targeted towards Gil and Jon, which is, hold on, I've already lost the question, but how, I'm curious to hear how your writing process, particularly for those of you who are journalists, what your writing process was for those of you who are journalists, when you were working on books. How did you balance the work you did for your job and still make time for your own writing outside of work? What worked for you and what didn't? So yeah, we need you to answer this question so that we can have another Brown author night in like a year. And no, just kidding.
Well, I mean, for me, the way I looked at it was my book was a story. It was telling a story. And I was very fortunate in one respect because, you know, Jon had mentioned working with a particular author. And it was really strange for me because I was teaching a grad school journalism class at Columbia, and I had a student in the class, and she introduced me to her boyfriend, who is a young journalist. And one day, one summer, I was reading a piece that he wrote, and it was a fantastic story about some criminal involvement from a former New York Yankees outfielder, Mel Hall. And I read this story. It was one of the best pieces I ever read. And I got in touch with him. And I think that as a journalist, you always can tell when a writer has a little bit, and I won't say this is not disparaging this writer at all, but had a little bit of really good guidance from an editor. And I knew that I wanted to write this story about American born and bred athletes playing Aussie rules football. And I asked him, the person who wrote the story, I said, who's your editor on this? You know, I'd really love to meet this editor. And the editor turned out to be a guy whose name is Glenn Stout. And Glenn happens to be, I found out, the curator and the editor of the best American sports writing.
Oh,
and,
wow.
you know, yeah. And so this is funny because in sports, if you follow professional sports, all of you, sometimes you believe that there are deities guiding these sports. So for me, there are definitely footy gods that are pushing me in certain directions, because I had pitched this story about American born and bred athletes playing Aussie rules, and a bunch of editors turned me down. And it just so happened that when I finally got in touch with Glenn Stout, I learned that he got it because he spent a semester abroad in Perth. And I was like, okay, great. You get it. You understand why I want to do this piece. And he was an excellent editor, pushed me really hard to do my best, the way any good editor should. And then what happened was, of all things, I got very fortunate because there was an agent out there that just so happened to read the piece that I wrote, which ended up on SB Nation, which was a sports website. And of all things, I got a tweet. Here we go with social media again. I got a tweet from him on Super Bowl Sunday. And I've long stopped watching American football, but I got this tweet from him on Super Bowl Sunday asking me the basic question, have you ever thought about writing a book about this? And he just happens to be a literary agent. And so that was a really fortuitous sign. And I really, at that point, ran out of excuses because I started thinking, well, you know, I don't know how to write a book proposal. And I told him that. Next day, he emails me a template for how to do one. And I'm thinking, okay, I've really run out of excuses here. I really should do this. And also, as a journalist, a really important thing, never throw away your notes, because this editor or this agent got in touch with me, I want to say in 2014, or actually, no, 2015. And at that point, I had saved notes from a story that I wrote from 2012 for the Australian Football League Record about a combine that Australians were doing for US male college basketball players to play one certain position in the game. And I had made, and incidentally, I made one of my best friends in Australia from pitching that story. So fortunately, I had all of these notes from 2012, and it ended up being a chapter. And the article that I wrote for SB Nation ended up being a sample chapter to go with my proposal. And then when I got into the writing of it, I was teaching. And I just made sure that I was going to devote a certain amount of time every week to writing, to researching and everything. And then finally, when it came down to it in November, I was visiting my dad over a holiday. And I just decided that I was going to move into one of the rooms of his large house at that time. And I was also going to change my sleeping habits for that week so that I would be on Australia time, because that's when I knew all of my contacts were going to be available. So my workday was kind of like something like 11 at night until 11 in the morning. And so I just totally changed it. Yeah. And then the other thing too, that I need to say is that I didn't grow up with the game. I didn't grow up having access to the game. And I had a real big challenge in that I had to write for an Australian audience who were already going to be skeptical about what does this person in America know about our game. So I'm a big fan of sports analogies. And so for baseball, it's a lot of things that don't show up in the box score that are really important. So no one can read my book and know that in the writing of this book, I read about 24 books on footy. And I lived it, breathed it, slept it, ate it, drank it. I'd go on YouTube and watch classic matches.
Well, it shows in the book, Gil.
Well, thank you.
Definitely shows.
Yeah, I mean, I had, and footy has a language all its own. I had to learn a lot of Australian sayings and everything, and really immerse myself in the culture, because I just did not have the advantage of growing up with the game. So the way I looked at it was I had a very short time to make up for lost time. And that was a real fun part for me. And John, I know you can relate to this as a journalist, is that when you're chasing down a story, you are a bulldog on that story. You refuse to let anybody beat you on this story. That, you know, you take ownership of it. And, you know, for those of you who knew me, I'm not the most competitive in the world. But when it comes to writing, oh yeah, I am very competitive. It's like, you are not going to beat me on this story. I am going to do everything I can, learn all I can, share it with my audience. And, you know, so if something developed, I was really not going to let anybody beat me to this story. And that's a really important thing. You have to be tenacious as a journalist and be willing to do the research. And as they'd say in Aussie English, put in the hard yards. And that gains you credibility. And just one last thing I'd like to say too, is that I did also work out a little bit of hooky from teaching one year from a job I knew I was going to leave. And I somehow cobbled together a whole bunch of frequent flyer points and turned that into going to this combine in Florida that the Australian Football League was having. I was able to finagle being away for 4 days, getting all my meals taken care of, getting a rental car, getting a place to stay, traveling all the way from California to Florida. I think it spent about $150. And it was, you just have to get really creative, inventive. And so, yeah, so I just sort of miraculously developed this 4-day stomach flu from school. But hey, it all worked out, and I got a chapter and a half out of doing that. So I would just say to young journalists or journalists in general, put it all on the line. You have to, when you're doing this is your baby, and you have to be able to fight for your story.
So my answer to that question is, like, I have to admit, I am not a natural or good multitasker. So I struggled with that question of, like, how do you balance, the book you want to write with, other professional responsibilities. And I have to say, I didn't have a science to it. Basically, if I was offered a freelance gig that paid me enough, I would put the book on pause. But that wasn't a science. It was really just some people are really good at multitasking and at compartmentalizing. That's not me. Like with the first book, it was easier because each chapter was kind of a self-contained entity. And so it was a little bit easier for me, but the second book was harder. And I found the whole balancing act much harder with the second book.
So I have a question for Zach here, which others can jump in if they want. And I think we're going to probably wrap this up at 9:15. I know Ashley probably has a closing question or two, but for Zach, you are an incredibly prolific novelist. I mean, most people write one novel that the critics like fall all over. You've written a whole bunch of them, and your novels feel like, from where I sit and others, that they take a lot of time, would take a long time to write, because when I read your novels, I have to concentrate and go back because the writing, as Tanuja
There's
said,
a lot going on.
yeah, it's so dense and beautiful. How do you manage your time? You teach, you're married, you have family, like how do you, and this is a question that I took a question somebody else had and added mine to it, which is, how do you balance all those things? And you actually write about it in your newest novel, like different worlds that people live in, kind of in consciousness and in physical reality. Talk about world balancing, because it's and sort of and competing pressures, because it's so evident in your writing.
Well, it's interesting because part of it is not that much different from being someone who likes to play the guitar. Like you want to do it, and so you find a way to structure your life so that you have time to do it. But it's unlike playing the guitar in that it's made out of language, and so the use that I've always made with my books is to, I don't know, to digest all of the stuff that's coming at me in the world, some of which is great and some of which is not so great. But I think I also often write about things that are upsetting to me and use the writing as a way to process the upsettingness of it, and then try to find a way to make that so it's not just personal to me, but that it might be something that someone else might want to engage with too. There's some radio static coming in here. But I don't know if anybody else can hear that, but I can hear it. I like doing it. I really, really like doing it. And it's as simple as that. And so because it is a form of self-indulgence, I just try to find ways to make it palatable for somebody else to maybe get interested in these things that I'm interested in, which are often random. My books are all very different. Sometimes they're about rock and roll and the 60s, and sometimes they're about incarceration, sometimes they're about Israel. I don't even know.
I love it when a novelist can do that, like can kind of switch genres almost. Like do like a sci-fi and a romance. Like I love that.
Yeah,
How do you get out of those worlds though? Because you bring in, I just think it would be so hard to get your head out of that to go on to the next thing. I just, or you want to stay there forever, like Bleak House, write 850 pages of it.
Well, fortunately, I did once write a very long novel, 10 years it took me to write it. That one was never published. And then I learned from that experience, no more of that. Yeah, I think that by writing about it for a few years, I exhaust whatever was interesting to me about it, usually, although not always. I mean, the Israel stuff and the incarceration stuff seems to be
Comes back,
a
yeah.
lasting interest, and a way to see the world in a way, actually. So, I get obsessed with things, and I think everybody does that as a writer. I think you have to do that as a writer, otherwise you wouldn't have the energy to do all this tedious work that writing involves, because writing
and
is
go back to it and yeah.
And I like the idea of what was said earlier about journalism not necessarily being about the quality of the writing so much as being about the interest in the world and the interest in reporting on the world. I'm coming at it from the other side. I'm mostly a style person, a language person, but what matters to me more now is saying something about the world, going out into the world, learning something about the world, and then sharing it with other people. A lot of my writing involves physically going to other places, which is A, very enjoyable, but B, also is super educating. I learn a lot that you cannot get from reading books. So it's a fun process because you explore what you're obsessed with, you physically travel to places that are connected to that, and that informs your imagination, and then you put it all in a pot together and think a lot about what all these pieces mean and how they relate to one another. And then it's a book.
Which
Beautiful. I love it. I love to read. I just
Me
want to
too.
read every day. It's all I want to do.
Yeah, well, I hear you. I hear you.
Well, actually, on that note, if you guys do want to read these incredible books, there's multiple ways you can do it. Lisa Ryers, our classmate, built this awesome website, which I put in the chat. I'll re-put it in the chat. It has links to the favorite places that our authors want you to buy their books from. So take a look at it, but you can buy them anywhere. We're going to make sure our authors tell us if they're on book tours. I'm looking at you, Zach. I think and John, you two are the two of the newest books. If you're doing a book talk anywhere, or if you're coming to Politics and Prose, which is literally down the DC bookstore down the road from me. I saw Zach speak there on his last novel, I think, or maybe the novel before, but I encourage you all to come out and see folks. We're also going to do a trivia contest. So there's information that was distilled in this that you don't know. And it will not have it won't be as hard as the flexed arm hang, because I am with the people on this chat that I was an anal type A grade student and was devastated because I could never get everything right on the presidential fitness test with the arm flying. But anyway, we're gonna do a trivia contest and a follow-up email with this recording. And the first person back to me who is not related by family to answer the question, you have to guess the author with each question. I'll put one out at a time, or I'll put them in and the first person back with each one will get a copy of the book. So the class is also going to buy copies of the book for our bookshelf, and we hope you all keep writing. But I'll turn it back over to Ashley and John to turn it to end. But I did want to plug incredible work by Lisa and our other classmates to promote our incredible authors.
I thought you were asking the trivia questions, JB.
I was going to, but I'm going to do it in the wrap-up email to everybody.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so we have more time. Do you have any like a lightning round last question that you want to?
Actually, I do have one, and this is a really self-serving question since I work in publishing, but I do have one for everybody. What is the one thing that y'all would change about the publishing industry / book world if you could? It can be something little, it can be something big. Like what annoys you most about the publishing world? It might be the social media thing. That we've
Yeah,
already
I mean,
talked
I
about.
think it gets back to your first question that this is a modern phenomenon, but the more Instagram followers you have, the more Twitter followers you have, the easier it is to sell a book. And I'm not even sure there's anything wrong with that, but this is why I've probably written my last book, because I don't want to live in that world. Like
Oh, it's so disheartening.
yeah, I mean, I don't, I have a friend who's a Christian author who wrote a book called Celebrities for Jesus, which is it's a sarcastic title. And she posted something on Instagram recently about how she shouldn't feel like she should have to do a TikTok dance in order to promote her very serious book. But that's the way she views publishing these days, that she's written a book about how.
Don't you mean book talk, John?
No, TikTok.
Yeah, well, there's a thing called book talk.
Oh, I don't even know, but she's joking around of like she has to do some like funny dance on TikTok in order to promote her very serious book about about Christianity. And I don't like when I talk about this with my kids, they think I'm like a million years old, which I probably am. And so I'm not even sure that it's a problem. I just know it's not for me.
Not for you. Okay, well, that's fair. That's fair. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think the having to promote in all of those ways. And another thing is also, I know one needs categories and genres to sell books, but what do you do when your young adult characters, if you want to keep following them into adulthood, which actually I do want to do with the ones, that are 17 in the first book, they're 19 and a half in the second book, although the feeling is much older because I was much older. And I am writing the third book. I'm just not clear on where that would be positioned because they've outgrown the YA genre. There was a lot of talk, I guess, in recent years about the new adult zone, like that kind of
sort of a hybrid. Yeah.
I don't really know if that's a thing, or I'm not really sure, like if that took off or what that space is. But I wish there was somehow more flexibility and freedom in just following your story wherever it takes you, and not having to kind of
position. Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
Or to switch, genres and style, like just to kind of not have to produce a version of the same thing like you produced, or be the new whoever.
I think I just wish the book world was more about books,
Yeah. Agree.
And it seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I kind of like the promotion of it. I remember working a really crappy retail job as a way to pay off one of my trips to Australia, and in LA, reading books about footy on the bus on the way to the job. And who would have thought that a year later, I'd be publishing a book and be on TV in Australia and not having to ride that bus anymore.
Gil, I want to go with you on your next trip. Sounds awesome.
Well, now that it finally seems like we've gotten our arms around COVID, looks like finally things are opening up where we can all do that again.
Yeah, let's hope so.
I'll even tell you my secret for the Trans-Pacific flight.
Ooh.
Yeah, on the 14 and a half hour flight from
Mhm.
LA to Melbourne, here's what I do. You stay up 24 to 48 hours straight before your flight.
Oh, God.
When you go to the airport bar, have a couple of red wines, and you'll sleep halfway through that flight,
just
and you'll
conk
land
out.
and you're ready to go in the morning. Guaranteed.
Okay.
I promise I'll check the numbers. I'll do the numbers for that for Jon Birger's next book. Jonathan, do you want to wrap us up? Do you notice my correct use of your name there too?
Oh, thank you very much. No, I want to thank everyone for joining. Ashley, fantastic. Thank you so much for leading
Oh, it
this
was
panel
such a
discussion.
pleasure. Such a
Just
pleasure.
wonderful.
My
And I
two
wanna-
favorite things, Brown and books and authors and reading. So it was awesome.
Wonderful. So thank you again. Thank you, Tanuja, John, Gil, and Zach for participating. So wonderful to hear all y'all. And Jennifer Backus, Jenny, for putting this together, really taking the lead. And like I said, for all y'all, keep staying posted with the newsletters. There'll be another event coming in the spring, but please share all ideas with us. Answer Jenny's, I think she posted in the chat room, the link, correct? Good. And on that note, appreciate it on a Wednesday evening. Thanks once again. Y'all take care and ever true.